I should have known that accepting a gift from Julian Beaumont on New Year's Eve would be the match that set my entire world ablaze. But standing there in the glittering ballroom of the Ashford Grand Hotel, with champagne bubbles dancing on my tongue and the weight of a stranger's well-wishes pressing against my shoulders, I convinced myself that I was finally, blissfully free from the man who had dominated every waking moment of my existence for 2 years before vanishing from my life like smoke 3 months ago. The necklace Julian presented to me was exquisite in a way that made my breath catch. All champagne-cut diamonds that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead and threw it back in brilliant fragments across my collarbone. And when he fastened it around my throat with fingers that trembled just slightly, I told myself that this was what normal felt like, what safe felt like, what a relationship with a man who didn't own half the city's underground empire and all of my treacherous heart was supposed to feel like. "It suits you, Mira," Julian murmured against my ear, his breath warm and entirely too intimate for the crowded ballroom where Manhattan's elite had gathered to toast the death of one year and the birth of another. And I found myself leaning into his touch because it had been so long since anyone had touched me with anything resembling tenderness. So long since I'd allowed myself to feel anything other than the aching absence of Dante Ashford's possessive hands on my skin. Julian Beaumont was everything Dante was not. Refined where Dante was raw. Gentle where Dante was commanding. An art dealer who spoke in soft tones about Caravaggio and Monet, rather than a man who spoke in violence and absolute control. And I had been telling myself for weeks now that this was better. That Julian's measured affection was healthier than Dante's all-consuming obsession. That I could build something normal with a man who didn't look at me like he wanted to devour me whole. The ballroom was a fantasy of white and gold. Hundreds of guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos swirling across the marble floors beneath chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's houses. And I let myself get swept up in it all, in the champagne and the laughter, and Julian's hand at the small of my back, guiding me through conversations with people whose names I immediately forgot, because my mind was still 3 months in the past, still trapped in the moment when Dante had looked at me with those storm-gray eyes and said, "You need to leave, Mira, and you need to forget you ever knew me," before walking out of my apartment and my life without another word of explanation. The countdown to midnight began somewhere around 11:50, the energy in the room building like a living thing. Champagne glasses being refilled, and couples gravitating toward each other in preparation for that magical moment, when the clock struck 12 and the world pretended that everything could start fresh, that the sins and sorrows of the past year could be left behind like discarded confetti on the ballroom floor. Julian pulled me closer as the countdown reached its final minute, his arms wrapping around my waist in a way that should have felt romantic, but instead felt like a cage I hadn't asked to be locked inside. And I tried to summon enthusiasm for his kiss, for the future he'd been hinting at with increasing frequency, for a life that didn't involve looking over my shoulder, wondering if Dante's surveillance teams were still watching my every move the way they had when we were together. 10, 9, 8, the crowd chanted, and I found myself touching the diamond necklace at my throat, feeling the weight of it. The cold perfection of stones that had probably cost Julian a month's salary, even though he insisted he wanted to spoil me, wanted to show me what it felt like to be cherished rather than owned. 7, 6, 5, and somewhere in the back of my mind a warning bell began to ring. Some instinct honed by 2 years of loving a man who saw everything and forgot nothing. A man who had made it clear when we were together that I belonged to him in ways that went beyond any legal or social contract. 4, 3, 2, and the massive doors at the far end of the ballroom crashed open with a sound like thunder, and my heart stopped completely because I knew. I knew before I even turned around, before I saw the sea of guests parting like he was Moses, and they were the Red Sea. Before I heard the sharp intake of Julian's breath, and felt him instinctively pull me closer, as if he could somehow protect me from what was coming. Dante Ashford strode into the ballroom like an avenging angel dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than Julian's car. his dark hair slightly disheveled as if he'd come here in a hurry. Those gray eyes that haunted my dreams, scanning the crowd with predatory focus until they locked onto me with an intensity that made my knees weak and my survival instincts scream at me to run. "Won!" someone whispered, but the jubilant shout of "Happy New Year" died in throats all across the ballroom as Dante crossed the space between us with long, purposeful strides, security guards materializing at his sides like shadows made flesh. And I realized with dawning horror that this was his hotel, that every camera in this building belonged to him, that he had watched Julian give me that necklace, and had decided to make a statement about it in the most public way possible. Julian's arms tightened around me protectively, foolishly, as if he didn't understand that Dante Ashford wasn't the kind of man you protected someone from. He was the kind of man who destroyed anything that stood between him and what he wanted. And what he wanted, apparently, was still me. "Step away from her, Beaumont," Dante said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom with that particular quality of controlled danger that I remembered from 100 arguments and 1,000 moments when his possessive nature had terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. And I felt Julian's hands fall away from my waist, because even he wasn't stupid enough to challenge a man who could end his career, his reputation, and quite possibly his life with a single phone call. I should have said something. Should have told Dante to leave. Should have asserted the independence I'd been building so carefully over these past 3 months. But my voice had abandoned me completely, leaving me frozen in place as Dante stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell his cologne. That dark, expensive scent that still clung to the one shirt of his I'd kept hidden in the back of my closet like a shameful secret. His hand came up to touch the diamond necklace at my throat, his fingers tracing the stones with a gentleness that was somehow more terrifying than violence would have been. And when he spoke, his voice was soft enough that only I could hear it, intimate in a way that made my entire body remember what it felt like to be the sole focus of his devastating attention. "Did you really think I wouldn't know, amore?" he asked, and the endearment in Italian hit me like a physical blow, dragging up memories of tangled sheets and whispered confessions and the way he used to worship my body like I was his own personal religion. "Did you think I stopped watching over you just because I sent you away?" Before I could answer, before I could process what was happening, his hand closed around the necklace and pulled, the delicate clasp breaking with a soft snap that seemed deafening in the silence, the sharp edge of it catching my skin and drawing a thin line of blood that I felt more than saw, hot against the winter-cold diamonds. The pain was sharp and immediate, but nothing compared to the shock of watching Dante walk to one of the massive fireplaces that lined the ballroom, where logs burned cheerfully for atmosphere, and throw Julian's expensive gift directly into the flames without a moment's hesitation, the diamonds glinting like dying stars as they disappeared into the inferno. "You wear what I give you, Mira," Dante said, returning to me with something in his hand that caught the light. Something that made my stomach drop because I recognized the platinum even before he was close enough for me to see the intricate metalwork, the craftsmanship that spoke of something made specifically for me, for this moment. "Or you wear nothing at all." The platinum choker was both beautiful and terrifying, delicate chains woven together in a pattern that suggested lace but felt unbreakable. And when Dante fastened it around my throat where Julian's necklace had been moments before, I felt the small lock at the back click into place with a finality that resonated somewhere deep in my bones. His fingers lingered on my neck, tracing the line where the necklace had cut me. And when he brought them away, there was blood on his fingertips. My blood, and the satisfaction in his eyes as he looked at it, made something dark and hungry unfurl in my chest, despite every rational thought telling me to be afraid. "I never gave you permission to move on," he said, loud enough now that the entire ballroom could hear. Loud enough that Julian and every other person in this room would understand exactly what was being claimed here, who I belonged to in Dante Ashford's mind. "You left me, Mira, and I allowed it because I thought it would keep you safe. But I never, not for one single moment, let you go." The room was spinning. Or maybe I was. The champagne and shock and the feeling of Dante's gift locked around my throat, combining into a dizzying cocktail that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to remember all the reasons I'd convinced myself that leaving him was the right choice. "You're mine until I say otherwise," Dante continued, his hand moving to cup my face with a possessiveness that should have made me angry, but instead made me feel like I was coming home after a long journey in the cold. "And I will never say otherwise." He turned then, addressing the crowd with the easy authority of a man who owned not just this hotel, but probably half the people in this room through debts and favors and the kind of leverage that came from knowing everyone's secrets, and his voice carried the weight of absolute command when he spoke. "The party is over," he announced, and people began moving immediately, gathering coats and abandoned champagne glasses and flowing toward the exits like water, until only Julian remained, standing frozen where I'd left him, his face pale with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Dante's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that looked almost tender, but felt like a shackle, and he began pulling me toward the private elevators that led to the penthouse suites, leaving Julian and the ruins of my attempted new beginning behind us in the echoing ballroom. "Dante, wait," I finally managed to say, finding my voice somewhere beneath the layers of shock and traitorous desire, pulling against his hold even though I knew it was useless, even though part of me didn't really want to escape. "You can't just—" "I can," he interrupted, pressing the button for the penthouse with his free hand while keeping me anchored to his side with the other, his body a wall of heat and muscle and barely controlled violence. "I own this hotel, I own half this city, and whether you want to admit it or not, Mira Solen, I own you too, and it's time we had a conversation about exactly what that means and why Julian Beaumont needs to disappear from your life before he gets you killed." The elevator doors closed on us, sealing me in with the man I'd spent 3 months trying to forget, the man whose collar I could feel locked around my throat like a brand, and as we ascended, toward whatever confrontation awaited me in the penthouse, I realized with a mixture of terror and dark anticipation that my carefully constructed new life had just gone up in flames as surely as Julian's diamond necklace, and I had no idea whether Dante Ashford was saving me or destroying me, only that I was about to find out. The elevator ascended with a silence that felt oppressive, mechanical and smooth in a way that gave me no distraction from the man standing beside me with his hand still locked around mine like he was afraid I might somehow pry open the doors and fling myself down the shaft rather than face whatever confrontation awaited us in the penthouse. And I found myself staring at our reflection in the polished metal doors, at the way his platinum choker caught the light around my throat, at the small line of blood that had dried there like some kind of primitive claiming mark. Dante's jaw was tight with an emotion I couldn't quite read, something between fury and relief, and that particular brand of possessive intensity that had always made me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. And when the elevator finally came to a stop with a soft chime that sounded absurdly cheerful, given the circumstances, I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, hard enough that I was certain he could hear it. The penthouse suite opened directly from the elevator, no hallway to provide even a moment's buffer between the confined space where I could feel the heat radiating from his body, and the sprawling luxury of rooms that screamed wealth and power, and the kind of control that Dante wielded as naturally as breathing. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the Manhattan skyline, glittering with a million lights that marked other people's New Year's celebrations, other people's fresh starts, other people's freedom. He released my hand only once we were inside, moving to pour himself a drink from the bar that occupied one corner of the living space with the kind of deliberate calm that I recognized as dangerous. The eye of the storm before the hurricane made landfall and destroyed everything in its path, and I stood frozen by the elevator doors trying to decide whether I should run or stay or demand answers, or simply accept that Dante Ashford had never been the kind of man who let anything go once he'd decided it belonged to him. "Julian Beaumont isn't who you think he is," Dante said finally, his back still to me as he poured what looked like expensive scotch into a crystal tumbler. the amber liquid catching the light in a way that reminded me absurdly of his eyes when he was angry, molten and burning. He's not some harmless art dealer who happened to fall for you, Mira. And the fact that you couldn't see that tells me I made a mistake sending you away without protection, without explanation, without making you understand the kind of danger that's been circling you like sharks since the moment you walked into the Castellano Gallery opening 6 months ago. The name of the gallery sent a jolt of recognition through me, memories surfacing of an evening I'd barely thought about since it happened. Julian introducing me to various collectors and artists, champagne and canapes, and conversations about Renaissance techniques that had seemed so normal, so far removed from the darkness of Dante's world that I'd been grateful for the normalcy of it all. "What does the Castellano Gallery have to do with anything?" I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, too high and uncertain, and I wrapped my arms around myself even though the penthouse was perfectly climate-controlled, because suddenly I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Dante turned to face me then, his expression carved from granite, and he pulled his phone from his pocket with movements that were precise and controlled, pulling up something on the screen before crossing the distance between us and holding it out for me to see. And what I saw there made my blood turn to ice in my veins despite the warmth of the room. The photos were surveillance footage, grainy but clear enough, showing me arriving at my apartment building at various times, me leaving for work in the mornings, me meeting friends for coffee, me existing in what I'd thought was privacy but was clearly anything but. And in every single shot, somewhere in the background or the foreground, or lurking at the edges of the frame, was Julian Beaumont, or someone who worked for him, watching, documenting, following. "He's been tracking you for months," Dante said, his voice soft in a way that was somehow more devastating than if he'd shouted, and he swiped to another set of photos, these ones showing me at the gallery opening, standing near a group of men I didn't recognize, and then those same men in what looked like crime scene photos, bodies arranged in ways that spoke of professional execution. These men were soldiers, in the Volkov family, Mira, Russian Mafia, who were moving in on territory that several families, including mine, have controlled for decades, and they were eliminated that night at the gallery, poison in their champagne, and you were standing less than 10 feet away when it happened. The room tilted sideways, or maybe I did, and suddenly Dante's hands were on my shoulders, steadying me, guiding me to the massive leather sofa that faced those floor-to-ceiling windows, and I let him because my legs had turned to water and my mind was racing through that evening, trying to remember if I'd seen anything, noticed anything, understood anything about what was happening around me while I'd been sipping champagne and discussing sfumato techniques with people who might have been murderers. "I don't remember anything," I whispered, and even to my own ears it sounded like a plea, like I was begging him to tell me this was all some elaborate mistake, that I hadn't somehow stumbled into the middle of a mob war without even realizing it. "I don't know anything about what happened that night, Dante, I swear to you. I was just there because Julian invited me. I thought it was just an art opening." "I know you don't remember," Dante said, and he crouched in front of me so we were eye level, his hands moving from my shoulders to cup my face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything else that was happening, with the violence implicit in those crime scene photos and the danger he was describing. "But the Volkov family doesn't know that, and Julian Beaumont has been positioning himself to use you as bait, to dangle you in front of them as a witness who could potentially identify who was behind the poisoning, to leverage you into a situation where you'd be forced to give them information you don't even have." The implications of what he was saying crashed over me like a wave, cold and suffocating. And I found myself gripping his wrists, where his hands still framed my face, needing something solid to anchor me while my entire understanding of the past few months rearranged itself into something sinister and calculated. "Why would Julian do that?" I asked, but even as the words left my mouth I knew the answer, could see it in the grim set of Dante's jaw, and the fury that burned behind his carefully controlled expression. "He's working for them, isn't he? For the Volkov family." Julian Beaumont is an informant who's been feeding the Volkovs intelligence about various families' operations for the past 3 years, Dante confirmed. And he stood, moving to the windows, as if he couldn't bear to stay still any longer. As if the energy of his anger needed somewhere to go before it consumed him entirely. He targeted you specifically because of your connection to me. Because he knew that getting close to you would give him leverage. That the Volkovs could use you to hurt me or force me into making deals that would benefit them. And I pushed you away 3 months ago because I realized what was happening, and I thought that if you weren't with me anymore, if it looked like we'd ended things, you'd be safe from becoming a target. The pieces were falling into place now. The abrupt end to our relationship that had left me devastated and confused. The way Dante had refused to give me any real explanation beyond saying I needed to forget him. The coldness in his voice that had felt like a knife to my heart, but had apparently been his attempt at protecting me from exactly the kind of danger he was describing now. But it didn't work, I said. And it wasn't a question because obviously it hadn't worked. Obviously Julian had found me anyway, and had spent the past 3 months positioning himself as my savior, my path to normalcy, my future, when all along he'd been using me as a pawn in a game I didn't even know was being played. It didn't work because the Volkovs are more desperate than I anticipated, Dante said, turning back to face me, and in the light from the windows his face looked harder than I'd ever seen it. All sharp angles and shadows that made him look like the dangerous man he actually was, rather than the lover I'd tried to remember him as. They're losing ground. Their operations are falling apart. And they need a win. Something that will reestablish their power and credibility. And taking down Dante Ashford by using his weakness against him would be exactly the kind of statement they need to make. I'm not your weakness anymore, I said. But even as I spoke the words, I knew they were a lie. Could feel the truth of our connection in the way he'd crashed into that ballroom like an avenging angel, in the way his collar sat around my throat like a brand, in the way he was looking at me now like I was something precious and dangerous that he needed to protect and possess in equal measure. You've always been my weakness, Mira, Dante said, and he crossed back to me with those long, purposeful strides, sitting beside me on the sofa close enough that I could feel the heat of him through the silk of my dress. You've been my weakness since the moment you spilled coffee on me in that bookstore 2 years ago, and looked up at me with those defiant eyes, and refused to be impressed by who I was or what I could do for you, and that's why I had to send you away, because in my world weakness gets exploited, gets used, gets destroyed. His hand found mine again, fingers intertwining in that same gesture that felt like both comfort and captivity, and when he pulled something from his jacket pocket with his free hand, I felt my stomach drop because I recognized a contract when I saw one, had seen enough of them during our relationship to know that Dante Ashford didn't make verbal agreements when written ones would serve better. What is that? I asked, even though I could already guess, could already feel the trap closing around me with the inevitability of fate, and part of me wanted to run while another part, a darker part that I'd been trying to ignore for 3 months, wanted to see what he would demand, what price he would extract for his protection. This is an arrangement, Dante said, setting the contract on the coffee table in front of us, along with an expensive pen that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. You sign this, you agree to stay under my protection for 6 months. You live where I tell you to live, you go where I tell you to go, you let me keep you safe while we eliminate the threat that Julian and the Volkovs represent. And in exchange, I guarantee that no harm will come to you, that you'll want for nothing, that you'll be protected by every resource I have at my disposal. And if I don't sign? I asked, but I already knew that answer too, could see it in the grim set of his mouth, and the regret that flashed through his eyes before his expression hardened again into something impenetrable. If you don't sign, I'll let the Volkovs know that you've been asking questions about that night at the gallery, that you've been working with federal investigators, that you're a threat to their operations whether it's true or not, Dante said, and the words hit me like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. They'll come for you, Mira. They'll take you and they'll torture you for information you don't have. And when they realize you're useless to them, they'll kill you and leave your body somewhere public as a message to everyone else who might think about cooperating with law enforcement. The casual way he described my potential death should have horrified me, should have made me hate him for threatening me this way. But I could see the pain behind his eyes, the way his jaw clenched like the words cost him something to say. And I understood with sudden, terrible clarity that this wasn't really a threat at all. It was a demonstration of exactly how much danger I was already in, whether I liked it or not. "You're giving me an impossible choice," I said, my voice breaking on the words because he was asking me to surrender my freedom, my independence, everything I'd been trying to build for myself in the months since he'd walked away. "You're asking me to choose between dying and becoming your prisoner." "I'm asking you to choose between dying and letting me keep you alive," Dante corrected, and his hand tightened on mine almost imperceptibly, a gesture that might have been unconscious, or might have been calculated to remind me of every moment we'd shared. Every time his touch had made me feel safe and desired, and utterly consumed. "I'm asking you to trust that I know what I'm doing, that I have resources and connections and the will to do whatever it takes to eliminate this threat. And I'm asking you to forgive me for handling this badly, for thinking I could protect you by pushing you away instead of keeping you close where I could see you." I looked at the contract sitting there on the coffee table, at the pen beside it that gleamed in the light from the city below, at the neat paragraphs of legal language that would bind me to Dante Ashford for 6 months of my life. And then I looked at him, at the man who had dominated my heart and my thoughts and my dreams even when I'd been trying desperately to forget him. "How do I know this isn't just another way to control me?" I asked. And I needed to know, needed to understand whether this was really about protection or whether it was about his inability to let me go, his possessive nature that couldn't stand the thought of me belonging to anyone else. "You don't," Dante said with brutal honesty, and there was something almost vulnerable in his expression when he continued. "You don't know, Mira, because I'm not going to lie to you and pretend this is purely altruistic, that I'm doing this only to keep you safe and not because the thought of you with Julian Beaumont, of you accepting gifts from another man and building a life that doesn't include me, made me want to burn down the entire city until you understood that you belong with me." His free hand came up to touch the platinum choker at my throat, tracing the delicate metalwork with fingers that trembled just slightly. And when he spoke again, his voice was raw with an emotion I'd rarely heard from him. "But I am asking you to believe that regardless of my motivations, regardless of how much of this is about keeping you safe versus keeping you mine, the danger is real and Julian's betrayal is real, and if you walk out of here tonight without signing this contract, there's a very real possibility that I'll get a phone call in a few days, informing me that your body has been found in the Hudson River, and I will not survive that." The elevator chimed then, an intrusion that made both of us tense, and Dante was on his feet instantly, his body positioning itself between me and whatever threat might emerge, his hand moving to the gun I knew he kept, concealed beneath his jacket. And when the doors opened, I saw Julian Beaumont step out flanked by 2 of Dante's security guards, who had him by the arms, his face bruised and bloodied in a way that made my stomach turn even as part of me whispered that he deserved it for using me, for lying to me, for putting me in danger. "I thought you might want to hear this from him directly," Dante said, his voice cold and clinical as he gestured for the guards to bring Julian closer, and I found myself standing despite my shaking legs, despite every instinct telling me to stay seated and small and invisible. "Tell her, Beaumont. Tell her exactly what the Volkovs promised you in exchange for delivering Mira Selene to them." Julian's eyes found mine, and there was something desperate in them. Something that might have been real emotion, or might have been an excellent performance. And when he spoke, his voice was thick with what might have been genuine regret, or might have been fear of what Dante would do to him if he didn't cooperate. "They promised me that they'd erase my gambling debts," Julian said, and each word sounded like it was being dragged out of him against his will. $3 million that I owe to various casinos and loan sharks, all of it gone in exchange for getting close to you, for documenting your routines, for eventually arranging a situation where they could take you and use you to get to Dante. And I'm sorry, Mira, I'm so sorry. But I was desperate, and they said they wouldn't hurt you. They said they just needed leverage. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected, even knowing what I now knew about Julian's real intentions, because some part of me had wanted to believe that at least some of what we'd shared had been real, that the gentle touches and soft words had meant something beyond just positioning me as a target. "Get him out of here," Dante said to the guards, his voice flat and emotionless. "Make sure he understands what happens if he tries to contact Mira again. Make sure he understands that his life continues only because I'm allowing it to continue, and make sure the Volkovs know that their informant has been compromised and is no longer of any use to them." The guards dragged Julian back into the elevator, and his eyes stayed locked on mine until the doors closed, something in his expression that might have been an apology or a warning, and then he was gone and I was alone again with Dante, and the contract that sat waiting on the coffee table like a serpent coiled to strike. I walked to the table on legs that felt disconnected from my body, picked up the expensive pen with hands that shook despite my attempts to control them, and looked down at the contract that would bind me to Dante Ashford for 6 months, that would put me back in the orbit of the man who had shattered my heart when he'd walked away. "If I sign this," I said, not looking at him, because I couldn't bear to see whatever expression was on his face, couldn't bear to let him see the conflicted emotions that were warring in my chest. "If I sign this, Dante, you need to promise me that when the 6 months are over, when the danger is past, you'll let me go if that's what I want, that you won't find some new threat to justify keeping me locked in your gilded cage." The silence stretched between us, long enough that I finally looked up at him, and what I saw in his face made my breath catch because it was naked vulnerability, raw emotion that he usually kept hidden beneath layers of control and calculated intimidation. "I promise," he said finally, and I knew he was lying. Knew it in the same way I knew that the sun would rise tomorrow and the earth would keep turning. Knew it because Dante Ashford was a man who didn't let go of what belonged to him. But I also knew that my choices had narrowed to this moment, this decision, this contract. I signed my name at the bottom of the document, the pen moving across the expensive paper with a T sound that seemed to echo in the quiet penthouse. And as I set it down and felt Dante's hand cover mine, guiding my still trembling fingers, I realized that I had just agreed to walk back into the darkness I'd spent 3 months trying to escape. Had just signed away my freedom to the one man who had ever made me feel both utterly safe and completely terrified. "When do we leave?" I asked, because there was no point in pretending this could wait. No point in hoping for a reprieve when danger was apparently circling closer with every passing moment. "Now," Dante said, and there was relief in his voice mixed with something that sounded almost like triumph as he pulled his phone out to make arrangements. "We leave now, tonight, and by morning you'll be somewhere the Volkovs can't reach you, somewhere I can keep you safe, somewhere you can finally understand that pushing you away was the biggest mistake I've ever made, and I'm not going to make it again." He moved toward the elevator, already barking orders into his phone about cars and security details, and closing down potential vulnerabilities. And I stood there with my hand touching the platinum choker locked around my throat, feeling the weight of the choice I'd just made settle onto my shoulders like a physical burden, and wondering whether I'd just saved my life, or surrendered my soul to the beautiful monster who had claimed me as his from the moment we'd met, who had just demonstrated that he would destroy anyone and anything that tried to take me away from him, and who was looking at me now with an expression that promised I was about to discover exactly what it meant to be under the absolute protection and possession of Dante Ashford. The drive to Dante's estate in the mountains north of the city took 3 hours through darkness that felt absolute, the kind of black that only exists when you've left behind the glow of Manhattan's million lights, and ventured into territory where civilization gives way to wilderness, where the bare trees stood like sentinels against a sky full of stars I'd forgotten existed. And I sat in the back of the armored SUV, with Dante's hand possessively covering mine, while my mind raced through everything that had happened in the span of a single evening, from Julian's diamond necklace to the contract I'd signed in what felt like my own blood. Security vehicles flanked us on all sides, a convoy of protection that spoke to the severity of the threat Dante had described. And every so often I would catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, something between satisfaction and concern, and that particular brand of possessive intensity that had always made me feel like I was the most important thing in his entire world, the axis around which his carefully constructed empire rotated. The estate revealed itself gradually as we wound up a private road that had probably cost a fortune to build. First, the massive iron gates that swung open it, our approach as if operated by invisible hands, then the sprawling stone walls that seemed to go on forever, enclosing what must have been hundreds of acres, and finally the house itself. Though calling it a house felt like calling the ocean a puddle, all soaring peaks and warm lights glowing from windows that looked out over valleys and forests that belonged entirely to the man sitting beside me. "This is where you've been living?" I asked, the first words I'd spoken since we'd left the city, and my voice sounded strange in the quiet interior of the vehicle, too loud and too uncertain, betraying all the emotions I'd been trying to keep locked behind the careful mask I'd constructed during the long drive. "This is where I've been existing," Dante corrected, and there was something bleak in his tone that made me look at him more closely, noticing for the first time the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw that spoke of sleepless nights, and the kind of stress that even his iron control couldn't completely hide. "This is where I've been working myself into the ground, trying to eliminate the threat against you, while simultaneously trying to respect your desire to be free of me, and failing spectacularly at both, because I couldn't focus on business when every security report that crossed my desk included updates on you accepting dates with Julian fucking Beaumont." The raw honesty in his admission surprised me, cut through some of the anger and fear I'd been nursing since he'd crashed into that ballroom and turned my entire world upside down, and I found myself squeezing his hand without consciously deciding to do so, offering comfort to the man who had essentially kidnapped me under the guise of protection. The SUV stopped in front of massive double doors that opened to reveal staff members who had apparently been roused from their beds to accommodate our midnight arrival, and Dante guided me out of the vehicle with a hand at the small of my back, that same possessive gesture that had always made me feel simultaneously cherished and owned, and I let him lead me into a foyer that looked like something out of a European castle, all marble floors and soaring ceilings and artwork that was probably worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. "The East Wing has been prepared for you," Dante said, gesturing to a woman who appeared to be the head of household staff, someone whose crisp efficiency and knowing eyes suggested she'd seen more than her share of Dante's complicated personal life. "Mrs. Chen will show you to your rooms and make sure you have everything you need, and we'll discuss the security protocols and house rules in the morning after you've had a chance to rest." The dismissal stung more than I wanted to admit. The way he was suddenly all business after the intensity of everything that had happened in the penthouse, and I found myself wanting to argue, to demand that we finish the conversation we'd started, to understand exactly what he expected from me during these 6 months, beyond simply existing in whatever luxurious prison he'd constructed. Mrs. Chen led me through a maze of hallways that all looked vaguely similar in their expensive elegance, past rooms whose purposes I could only guess at, until finally we arrived at a set of doors that opened into what she called my suite, but which looked more like an entire apartment, complete with a bedroom that could have held my old apartment's living room twice over, a bathroom done in marble and gold that looked like something from a spa, and a sitting area with floor-to-ceiling windows that I realized must overlook the mountains and valleys Dante owned. "Mr. Ashford wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable," Mrs. Chen said, with the kind of diplomatic neutrality that suggested she'd been trained not to comment on her employer's personal affairs, and she showed me the walk-in closet that had already been stocked with clothes in exactly my size. The bathroom cabinets filled with my preferred brands of everything from shampoo to skincare. The bookshelves lined with titles I recognized as favorites I'd mentioned to Dante during our relationship. "If you need anything at all, there's a phone by the bed that connects directly to the kitchen and my office, and security is monitoring all the entrances and grounds, So you're perfectly safe here." Safe felt like such a relative term when I was essentially a prisoner in a beautiful cage. But I thanked her anyway, and waited until she'd left before I allowed myself to really look at the space that was apparently going to be my home for the next 6 months. At all the careful details that spoke of Dante's attention and his memory, and his absolute refusal to let me be uncomfortable, even when he was holding me captive. Sleep felt impossible despite the exhaustion that was making my bones ache. So I spent the hours until dawn exploring my gilded cage, discovering the small details that Dante had included. The favorite tea blend I'd been obsessed with when we were together. The specific brand of chocolate I preferred. The framed photograph of us from 2 years ago that I'd thought was lost, where we were laughing at something I could no longer remember, and his arms were wrapped around me like he never intended to let go. The sun rose over the mountains in shades of pink and gold that took my breath away, despite everything else that was happening. And I stood at those floor-to-ceiling windows watching the light spread across the valleys below, and wondering how something so beautiful could feel so much like a prison, how Dante's protection could feel so much like possession, how I could be simultaneously grateful for his intervention and furious at his presumption that he had the right to make these choices for me. A soft knock on the door interrupted my spiraling thoughts, and when I called for whoever it was to enter, I was surprised to see Dante himself rather than Mrs. Chen or one of the other staff members, and he looked different in the morning light streaming through the windows, younger somehow despite the expensive suit he wore, more human and less like the dangerous crime lord he actually was. "I thought you might want breakfast," he said, and I noticed for the first time that he was carrying a tray laden with what looked like all of my favorite foods, the particular pastries I loved from a bakery in the city, the fruit I preferred, the coffee prepared exactly the way I liked it. And the gesture was so unexpectedly domestic that I felt something in my chest crack open just a little bit. "You didn't have to bring it yourself," I said. But I accepted the offering anyway because I was hungry, and because refusing felt petty when he'd clearly gone to some effort. And he set the tray down on the small table near the windows, before settling into the chair across from where I'd curled up on the window seat. "I wanted to," Dante said simply, and he watched me eat with an intensity that should have made me uncomfortable but instead felt oddly intimate, like we were sharing something more significant than breakfast. "I wanted to see you here, in the morning light, safe in a place where nothing and no one can reach you without going through me first. And I wanted to apologize for the way I handled everything last night, for threatening you and forcing your hand when you deserved better." The apology surprised me enough that I set down the pastry I'd been eating and really looked at him, searching his face for signs of manipulation or calculation. But all I could see was genuine regret mixed with that same possessive satisfaction that he'd been radiating since he'd locked his collar around my throat. "You're not sorry you did it, though," I said. And it wasn't a question, because I could read him well enough to know the truth. "You're sorry you had to use threats and fear to get me here, but you're not sorry that I'm here, that you have me exactly where you want me." "No," Dante agreed with that brutal honesty that had always been one of the things I both loved and hated about him. "I'm not sorry you're here, Mira. I'm not sorry that I have you safe and protected and within reach, because the alternative was watching you walk away with Julian Beaumont and knowing that every day you spent with him was a day closer to the Volkovs making their move. And I wouldn't survive that." He stood then and crossed to where I sat, and before I could process what was happening, he was kneeling in front of me the way he had in the penthouse, his hands coming up to frame my face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything else about this situation, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I know you hate me right now," he said, and his thumbs traced the line of my cheekbones in a gesture that was achingly familiar, that reminded me of 100 mornings when we'd woken up tangled together, and he'd touched me exactly like this, with reverence and possession in equal measure. "I know you think I'm a monster for the way I've handled this, for taking away your choices and your freedom and forcing you back into my life. But I need you to understand that every decision I've made, every move I've orchestrated, has been about keeping you alive And if that makes me a monster, then I'll accept that title gladly as long as you're breathing. I wanted to pull away, wanted to maintain the anger that felt safer than the complicated tangle of emotions his words were stirring up. But I found myself leaning into his touch instead. Found myself remembering all the reasons I'd fallen in love with him in the first place, the way he made me feel seen and valued and utterly central to his existence. "I don't hate you," I whispered, and the admission felt like surrender, like giving up some essential part of the independence I'd been trying so hard to claim. "I hate that you were right, that Julian was using me, that I was too naive or too desperate to see it, and I hate that I'm relieved to be here with you even though I should be demanding you let me go." Something fierce and triumphant flashed through Dante's eyes at my words, and his hands tightened on my face just slightly before he stood, putting distance between us, as if he didn't trust himself to maintain control if he stayed close. "The estate is yours to explore," he said, his voice carefully neutral now, all business despite the emotion that had been vibrating between us moments before. "The only restriction is that you don't leave the walls without security, preferably without me, and that you check in with Mrs. Chen or one of the guards so we always know where you are, and I know those rules feel suffocating, but they're necessary until we've eliminated the threat." "How long will that take?" I asked, because 6 months felt like an eternity, but also like not nearly enough time if I was honest with myself about how much I'd missed this, missed him, missed the intensity of being the sole focus of his devastating attention. "As long as it takes," Dante said, and there was something dark in his expression that reminded me exactly what kind of man he was, what he was capable of when something he considered his was threatened. "I have people working on locating the Volkov's operations, on finding leverage we can use to force them to back off, on making it clear that touching you means declaring war on me and everyone allied with me. And when we're done, when they understand that you're untouchable, then we'll discuss what happens next." He moved toward the door, clearly intending to leave me to finish my breakfast and adjust to my new reality. But something made me call out to him before he could disappear into the hallway. Some need to understand what exactly he expected from me beyond simply existing in his protected paradise. "Dante," I said, and he paused with his hand on the doorframe, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What are we, here? What is this arrangement beyond the contract I signed? Are you expecting me to just live here like some kind of kept woman while you go about your business? Or are you wanting something else? Something more?" The question hung in the air between us, weighted with all the history we shared, and all the unresolved feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface since he'd walked into that ballroom. And when he answered, his voice was low and rough with barely contained desire. "What I'm wanting, Mira, is for you to remember why you fell in love with me in the first place," he said, and the honesty of it hit me like a physical blow. "I'm wanting for you to see that pushing you away was the biggest mistake of my life, that these past 3 months without you have been hell, that I kept every single thing you left behind because I couldn't stand to erase evidence of your existence from my life, and I'm wanting for you to choose me, really choose me, not because you're afraid or because you signed a contract under duress, but because you understand that what we had was real and rare and worth fighting for." Before I could formulate a response to that devastating admission, before I could process the implications of what he was really asking for, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and leaving me alone with my breakfast and my racing thoughts, and the growing realization that Dante Ashford hadn't brought me here just to keep me safe. He'd brought me here to wage a campaign for my heart, to remind me of everything we'd been together, to seduce me back into his orbit not through force but through the slow, inexorable pull of the connection we'd never really severed. The day passed in a strange haze of exploration and adjustment, Mrs. Chen giving me a tour of the parts of the estate I was permitted to access, showing me the library that must have contained thousands of books, the gym that looked like something from a luxury hotel, the indoor pool with its glass ceiling that let in natural light, the gardens that even in winter were beautiful in their stark, sculptural way. Guards were everywhere, discreet but unmistakable, and I realized with growing unease that Dante's protection came with constant surveillance, that privacy was apparently a luxury I'd surrendered along with my freedom when I'd signed that contract. And the thought should have made me angrier than it did, but instead I found myself feeling oddly secure, knowing that nothing could reach me here without going through layers of trained professionals. Dinner was served in my suite despite my half-hearted protests that I could eat in the main dining room, and when the staff member wheeled in the cart laden with dishes that all happened to be my favorites, I realized that Dante was orchestrating everything, ensuring that every moment of my captivity was as comfortable and luxurious as possible, and I couldn't decide if that made him more or less of a monster. Night fell over the mountains, with the same dramatic beauty as the sunrise had brought, and I found myself back at those floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the lights of the estate glow against the darkness, trying to reconcile my anger at being held prisoner with my relief at being protected, my resentment of Dante's presumption, with my reluctant admission that part of me had never stopped loving him. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts again, and this time when I called for entry, it was Dante himself who appeared, carrying what looked like a worn cardboard box that seemed incongruous with the expensive elegance of everything else in this place. "I thought you might want these," he said, setting the box down on the table where we'd shared breakfast that morning, and when I moved closer to investigate, I felt my breath catch in my throat, because it was full of things I'd thought were lost, photographs and books and small trinkets from our relationship, including the scarf I'd left behind at his penthouse the night he'd ended things. The one I'd cried over for days because it had smelled like him, and wearing it had made me feel close to him even after he was gone. "You kept all of this?" I asked, my voice breaking on the words because the implications were staggering, because it meant that Dante had been just as devastated by our separation as I had been, that he'd held on to physical reminders of our relationship, the same way I'd kept his shirt hidden in my closet like a shameful secret. "I kept everything," Dante said, and he moved to stand beside me, looking down at the contents of the box, with an expression that was equal parts regret and longing. "I kept your toothbrush in my bathroom for 2 months, before I finally admitted you weren't coming back. I kept the coffee you preferred stocked in my kitchen, even though I hate the taste of it. I kept the pillow you always used because it still smelled like your shampoo, and sleeping without it felt impossible. And I kept telling myself that I was doing the right thing, that pushing you away was protecting you, when really I was just slowly destroying both of us." His confession hung in the air between us, raw and vulnerable in a way that Dante rarely allowed himself to be, and I found myself reaching for him without conscious thought, my hand finding his and holding tight because despite everything that had happened, despite the contract and the threats and the gilded cage he'd locked me in, this felt real in a way that nothing with Julian ever had. "I hate that you're right," I said again, and this time there was less anger in it and more resignation, more acceptance of the truth that I'd been running from for 3 months. "I hate that you were protecting me even when it felt like you were abandoning me. I hate that Julian was using me and I was too blind to see it, and I hate that being here with you feels more like coming home than anything I've experienced since you walked away." Dante turned to face me fully then, his free hand coming up to touch the platinum choker that I'd almost forgotten I was wearing, that had become such a constant presence that I barely noticed its weight anymore. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with barely controlled emotion. "I'm not going to apologize for claiming you, Mira," he said, and his thumb traced the delicate metalwork at my throat with reverence. "I'm not going to pretend I'm sorry for making sure every person in that ballroom understood that you belonged to me, because the truth is I've been half crazy without you. I've been making mistakes in business that I never would have made if I could focus on anything other than wondering if you were safe, if you were happy, if you were thinking about me the way I couldn't stop thinking about you." Before I could respond, before I could tell him that I had been thinking about him constantly, that moving on had felt impossible when every man I met fell short of the standard he'd set, he closed the distance between us and kissed me with a desperation that stole my breath, his hands tangling in my hair and his body pressing mine back against the table where the box of memories sat forgotten. The kiss was everything I remembered, and nothing like I remembered at the same time. Familiar in its intensity, but desperate in a way that spoke of 3 months of separation and longing. And I found myself kissing him back with equal fervor, my hands fisting in his expensive shirt and pulling him closer, needing to feel the solid reality of him after so many nights of dreaming about exactly this. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dante rested his forehead against mine with his eyes closed, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but I heard every word like it was being carved into my soul. "Tell me you feel it too," he said, and there was something almost pleading in his tone, something vulnerable that I'd rarely heard from a man who projected nothing but confidence and control. "Tell me I'm not insane for believing that what we had was worth all of this, worth the threats and the manipulation and the absolute refusal to let you go. Tell me you understand that I would burn down the entire world before I let anyone hurt you." "I feel it," I admitted, and the words felt like both surrender and liberation, like accepting a truth I'd been running from since the moment he'd walked into that ballroom. "I feel it, Dante, and I hate myself for it. I hate that you can manipulate me this way, that you can force me here and lock your collar around my throat and kiss me like you own me and I just accept it. But I do feel it. I feel everything. And I don't know if that makes me weak or honest or just completely insane." His smile when he pulled back to look at me was fierce and possessive and edged with something that looked almost like relief. And he traced my lower lip with his thumb in a gesture that was both tender and claiming. "It makes you mine," he said simply. And then he kissed me again. Slower this time, but no less intense. And I let myself get lost in it. Let myself forget for a moment about the danger and the contract and the fact that I was essentially his prisoner, because being in Dante Ashford's arms felt like the only place I'd ever truly belonged, and the terrifying truth was that I wasn't sure I wanted to leave even if he gave me the choice. The weeks that followed my arrival at Dante's mountain fortress passed in a strange, dreamlike quality, where days blended together in a haze of increasing intimacy and decreasing resistance, where the boundaries I'd tried so desperately to maintain crumbled a little more each time he touched me with that particular combination of reverence and possession that made me forget why I'd ever thought leaving him was a good idea, and I found myself slipping back into the rhythm of us with a ease that should have terrified me but instead felt like finally being able to breathe again after months of suffocating. Dante was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, running his empire from the estate's command center that I wasn't permitted to enter, but catching meals with me when his schedule allowed, appearing in the library where I'd taken to spending my afternoons with books I'd been meaning to read for years, joining me for morning coffee with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent orchestrating whatever campaign he was waging against the Volkovs while I slept safely in my gilded cage. The restrictions he'd placed on my movements began to feel less like imprisonment and more like the kind of protective attention that I'd missed during our separation. And I caught myself seeking him out rather than avoiding him, finding excuses to be in whatever room he occupied, drawn to his presence like a moth to a flame that I knew would probably burn me, but couldn't resist anyway. It was on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks into my captivity that everything changed, when I woke to the sound of shouting and gunfire that shattered the peaceful silence of the estate with a violence that sent my heart racing and my survival instincts screaming at me to hide. And I barely had time to process what was happening before my bedroom door crashed open and Dante stormed in with a gun in his hand and an expression on his face that was equal parts fury and fear. "Get dressed now. We need to move you to the safe room," he commanded, and there was no room for argument in his tone, no space for questions about what was happening or why the security he'd promised was absolute had apparently been breached, and I scrambled to obey even as my hands shook so badly I could barely manage to pull on clothes over the silk nightgown I'd been sleeping in. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, punctuated by shouting and what I thought might be Russian, and Dante's hand found mine with bruising force as he pulled me toward a section of wall that I'd never noticed was actually a hidden door, his body positioned between me and whatever threat was advancing through the hallways of his fortress, with the kind of protective instinct that would have been romantic if it wasn't so absolutely terrifying. "They found us faster than I expected," Dante said as we descended a staircase that seemed to go down forever into the mountain itself, carved from stone and lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in harsh shadows. Julian must have given them more information than I realized about the estate's layout, about the security protocols, about where I'd be most vulnerable, and I swear to you, Mira, I swear on everything I am, that I will kill every single person who thought they could come into my home and threaten what's mine. The violence in his voice should have frightened me, but instead I found it oddly comforting. The certainty that Dante would stop at nothing to protect me, that he would paint the walls with blood before he let anyone take me from him. And I held tighter to his hand as we reached the bottom of the stairs, and he guided me into what could only be described as an underground bunker, complete with reinforced walls and enough supplies to last for weeks. "Stay here," Dante ordered, his hands framing my face in that gesture that had become so familiar, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my chest ache. "Stay here and don't open this door for anyone except me. I don't care if they sound like security or Mrs. Chen or God himself. You only open this door when you hear my voice saying your full name, do you understand?" I nodded because words felt impossible with the sound of violence echoing down from above, with the reality of the danger Dante had been describing, finally manifesting in gunfire and shouting, and the knowledge that people were dying up there. Probably people who worked for Dante, probably people whose only crime was being loyal to a man who inspired that kind of devotion. Dante kissed me then, with a desperation that stole what little breath I had left, his mouth claiming mine like he was afraid it might be the last time, like he needed to memorize the taste of me before he went back upstairs to face whatever hell was waiting. And when he pulled away, there was something in his eyes that looked almost like goodbye. "If something happens to me," he started, but I pressed my hand over his mouth before he could finish that sentence, before he could voice the possibility that had my heart threatening to tear itself out of my chest. "Nothing is going to happen to you," I said, with a conviction I didn't entirely feel but needed to believe. "You're going to go up there and you're going to eliminate this threat the way you eliminate every threat, with ruthless efficiency and absolute control. And then you're going to come back down here and tell me it's safe, and we're going to continue this conversation about what happens when the 6 months are over." Something fierce and possessive flashed through Dante's expression at my words, and he kissed me once more. Harder this time, branding me with the touch before he stepped back and pulled the heavy door closed between us, the sound of locks engaging echoing in the small space with a finality that made me want to scream. The waiting was agony. Sitting in that underground room with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the distant echo of violence that seemed to go on forever. Every gunshot making me flinch. Every shout making me wonder if it was Dante's voice I was hearing. If he was hurt. If he was dying while I sat here safe and useless in the fortress he'd built to protect me. Hours passed. Or maybe it was only minutes that felt like hours. Time becoming meaningless in the artificial light of the bunker, and I found myself pacing the small space like a caged animal, touching the platinum, choker at my throat like a talisman, praying to a god I wasn't sure I believed in, that Dante would survive this, that he would come back to me, that I would get the chance to tell him all the things I'd been too afraid to admit even to myself. When the locks on the door finally disengaged, I nearly collapsed with relief. But Dante's warning echoed in my mind, and I pressed myself against the far wall, waiting, barely breathing, until I heard his voice calling my full name. Mira Solène. And then the door was opening, and he was there, covered in blood that I prayed wasn't his suit torn and his face bruised but alive, gloriously and terrifyingly alive. I crashed into him before I could think better of it, my arms wrapping around his neck and my face pressing into his chest despite the blood and the gunpowder smell and the violence that clung to him like a second skin, and his arms came around me with crushing force, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe, but I didn't care, because he was here and he was whole, and the relief was so overwhelming it brought tears to my eyes. "It's over," Dante murmured against my hair, one hand coming up to cradle the back of my head, while the other remained locked around my waist. They're all dead. Every single one of them who thought they could breach my home and take you from me. And I have Julian Beaumont restrained upstairs because apparently he led them here personally. Apparently his obsession with you went deeper than simple financial desperation. And I need you to be strong for what comes next, Amore. Because I need you to hear from him exactly what the Volkovs promised him. Exactly how long he's been planning this. Exactly how much danger you've been in since the moment you met him. The revelation that Julian was here, that he had personally led an assault on the estate, sent ice through my veins colder than any fear I'd felt during the attack itself. And I pulled back to look at Dante's face, at the grim satisfaction in his expression that told me he'd been waiting for this confrontation, that perhaps he'd even orchestrated parts of it to force Julian into revealing his true allegiances. I want to see him, I said, and my voice was steadier than I'd expected. I want to hear him admit what he's done. I want to understand why he would risk everything for whatever the Volkovs promised him. And then I want you to make him disappear, Dante. I want you to eliminate the threat the way you promised you would, because I'm done being afraid. I'm done being the weakness that people use against you. And I'm done pretending that I don't want exactly what you're offering. The fierce approval in Dante's eyes at my words made something dark and powerful unfurl in my chest. And when he took my hand to lead me back up those stone stairs toward whatever confrontation awaited us, I realized that I had finally stopped fighting the truth of what I was, of what we were together, and the woman who emerged from that bunker was not the same one who had signed a contract under duress 3 weeks ago. She was someone harder, someone who understood that survival in Dante's world required embracing the darkness rather than running from it. Someone who was ready to stand beside a monster and claim him as utterly and completely as he had claimed her. The room where they'd brought Julian Beaumont was one I'd never seen before, deep in the part of the estate that Dante had kept carefully hidden from me. All concrete walls and harsh lighting that stripped away any pretense of civilization and revealed the brutal truth of what my lover was capable of when something he considered his was threatened. And when I saw Julian tied to a chair with blood streaming from cuts on his face, and that desperate, manic look in his eyes that spoke of a man who knew his time was running out, I felt something shift inside me. Some final vestige of the naive woman I'd been crumbling away to reveal someone harder, someone capable of watching what was about to happen without flinching. Dante's hand was warm and steady on the small of my back as he guided me into the room, his presence a solid reassurance even as Julian's eyes found mine, and I saw something in them that made my stomach turn. Not guilt or remorse, but obsession. The kind of twisted devotion that had apparently been festering beneath his gentle art dealer facade for longer than I'd ever suspected. "Tell her," Dante commanded, his voice cold and clinical in a way that reminded me exactly what kind of man he was, what he did to people who threatened what belonged to him. "Tell Mira exactly when you decided she would be your salvation, when you first started planning to use her as a bargaining chip with the Volkovs, when your interest in her stopped being about the debt you owed and started being about something far more disturbing." Julian's laugh was broken and bitter, blood speckling his lips as he spoke. And the words that came out of his mouth rewrote everything I thought I'd understood about our relationship, about the timeline of events that had led me here. "I've been in love with you since before you ever met him," Julian said, and each word felt like a revelation that made the room tilt sideways. "I saw you first, at that bookstore where you spilled coffee on Dante fucking Ashford. I was there buying a gift for a client, and I watched you look up at him with those defiant eyes, and I knew that you were extraordinary, that you were exactly the kind of woman who could make a man like me feel alive. But he got to you first. He claimed you before I could work up the courage to approach you. And I've spent the past 2 years watching you belong to someone else, watching you love someone who doesn't deserve you, planning how I could make you mine." The obsession in his voice was chilling, made worse by the casual way he admitted to stalking me, to orchestrating our meeting at the gallery, to positioning himself as my savior when Dante pushed me away. And I felt Dante's hand tighten on my back, felt the violence radiating from him in waves that promised Julian's death would not be quick or painless. The Volkovs approached me about my gambling debts. Julian continued, seemingly unable to stop now that he'd started, words pouring out like a confession he'd been holding back for too long. They said they'd erase everything if I could get them information about Dante's operations, if I could give them leverage they could use against him. And at first it was just business, just survival. But then I realized that if I could make you vulnerable enough, if I could position you as the key to bringing Dante down, maybe in the chaos of whatever came next, you'd finally see me. Finally understand that I could give you a normal life, a safe life, a life where you weren't constantly looking over your shoulder wondering when his enemies would use you to hurt him. The twisted logic of his obsession made me feel sick, made me understand exactly how close I'd come to being destroyed by a man who thought he loved me but really only loved the idea of possessing me, of saving me from Dante so I would be grateful enough to belong to him instead. And when I spoke, my voice was colder than I'd ever heard it, harder than I'd known I was capable of being. "You never loved me," I said, and I stepped forward out of Dante's protective hold, needing Julian to see my face when I said this, needing him to understand exactly what he'd lost through his own obsession and manipulation. "You loved the fantasy of me, the challenge of taking something that belonged to someone else, and you were willing to hand me over to the Volkovs to be tortured and killed if it meant you could position yourself as my rescuer afterward, if it meant you could manipulate me into feeling grateful enough to give you what you wanted. And that's not love, Julian. That's possession without even the honesty that Dante brings to his claiming of me." Something crumpled in Julian's expression at my words, some final hope dying in his eyes, and he looked at Dante with an expression that was equal parts hatred and resignation. "So this is where you give me a choice," Julian said, and there was dark humor in his voice, like he understood the script we were all following. "This is where you tell me I can walk away if she promises to forget me, where you prove you're the bigger man by showing mercy, where you demonstrate that you're not the monster everyone thinks you are." Dante's smile was cold and predatory as he moved to stand beside me, his hand finding mine and holding tight. And when he spoke, there was no mercy in his voice, no hesitation. Nothing but absolute certainty and the promise of violence. "There are no choices here, Beaumont," Dante said, and he pulled his gun from the holster beneath his jacket with practiced ease. "There's only consequences for the choices you already made, for thinking you could use Mira as a pawn in your pathetic games, for leading the Volkovs to my home, for putting the woman I love in danger because you couldn't accept that she was never going to be yours. And I'm not going to pretend this is about mercy or justice or giving you a chance to make amends, because the truth is I've been waiting for an excuse to eliminate you since the moment I saw you put that diamond necklace around her throat." The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, final and absolute. And I didn't look away as Julian's body slumped in the chair, as the obsession that had driven him drained away with his blood. Because this was the reality of loving Dante Ashford. This was the darkness I'd agreed to embrace when I'd signed that contract and let him lock his collar around my throat. And if I was going to stand beside him, I needed to do it with my eyes open to exactly what that meant. Dante turned to me immediately, his hands framing my face and his eyes searching mine for signs of horror or regret or rejection. And what he must have seen there made something fierce and possessive flash through his expression because he kissed me hard, claiming my mouth with an intensity that tasted like violence and victory, and the absolute certainty that I was his in every way that mattered. "Marry me," he said when he finally pulled back. And the words weren't a question but a statement, a claiming, a demand that I give him not just 6 months but forever. "Marry me, Mira, not because of the contract or the danger or because I'm giving you a choice, but because you understand now what we are together, because you've seen the worst of me and you're still standing here, because you chose me when you could have asked me to spare him, and we both know you didn't even consider it." The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow, because he was right. I hadn't even thought about asking for Julian's life. Hadn't considered mercy for a man who would have handed me over to be destroyed. and that realization told me everything I needed to know about who I'd become in these weeks of captivity, about the woman who had emerged from loving a monster. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like both surrender and victory, like accepting a truth I'd been running from since the moment Dante had walked back into my life. "Yes, I'll marry you. Not because you're asking, but because I'm choosing this. Choosing you. Choosing a life where I'm claimed and protected and possessed by a man who would burn down the world before he let anyone hurt me. And I know that makes me just as dark as you are, just as dangerous, just as willing to embrace violence if it means keeping what's mine." The wedding happened 3 days later in the estate's chapel. A small, intimate ceremony with only the staff as witnesses. And when Dante slid the ring onto my finger, platinum to match the choker that he finally unlocked and replaced with something more delicate, a collar of diamonds that was no less acclaiming but infinitely more beautiful, I felt the last of my resistance crumble away, felt myself finally accepting the truth that I belonged to Dante Ashford in ways that went beyond any legal or social contract, in ways that were primal and absolute and utterly inescapable. Our wedding night was spent in the master suite that I'd never been permitted to enter before, and as Dante worshipped my body with a reverence that bordered on religious devotion, as he whispered promises against my skin about the life we would build together, about the empire we would rule side by side, about the children we would someday have who would inherit both his power and my strength, I realized that the woman who had attended that New Year's Eve gala 3 weeks ago would barely recognize the person I'd become, would be horrified by the violence I'd witnessed, and the darkness I'd embraced, and the absolute certainty with which I'd chosen a man who loved me with the intensity of obsession. But as I lay in Dante's arms with the diamond collar glinting at my throat, and his ring heavy on my finger, as I listened to his heartbeat slow and steady beneath my ear, and felt his hand tracing possessive patterns on my hip, I understood that this was what I'd always needed, this consuming devotion that left no room for doubt or distance, this love that was willing to destroy anything that threatened it, this partnership that acknowledged the darkness in both of us and celebrated it rather than trying to hide it behind polite society's expectations of what relationships should look like. "Happy New Year, Mrs. Ashford," Dante murmured against my hair, and I smiled into the darkness of our bedroom, touching the diamonds at my throat that marked me as his in ways that went soul deep. "Happy New Year, husband," I whispered back, and there was no fear in my voice anymore, no uncertainty, nothing but acceptance of the beautiful, dangerous, absolutely perfect life I'd chosen. "I hope you're ready for what you've claimed, because I'm not the naive girl who signed your contract anymore. I'm the woman who stood beside you and watched you eliminate threats without flinching, and that makes me just as dangerous as you are." His smile against my skin was fierce and satisfied, and his arms tightened around me with possessive certainty as he spoke the words that felt like both promise and prophecy. "I've been ready since the moment I met you, amore," he said, and in his voice I heard the echo of every moment that had led us here, every choice that had brought us to this point, every sacrifice that had been necessary to build this dark and perfect union. "I've been ready for exactly who you are, for the darkness you're capable of, for the woman strong enough to stand beside me and claim me right back, and I will spend every day of the rest of our lives proving that you made the right choice when you accepted my collar and my ring and my absolutely unbreakable devotion, and as sleep finally claimed me in the safety of his arms, in the fortress he'd built to protect what was his, I knew with absolute certainty that this was where I belonged, that Dante Ashford's obsessive love was exactly what I'd been searching for without knowing it, and that the woman who had tried so desperately to escape him 3 months ago would never have survived in his world the way the woman I'd become would not just survive, but thrive, ruling beside him with the same ruthless intensity that he brought to everything he touched, and loving him with a devotion that was every bit as consuming and unbreakable as his love for me.